Well, from New York, we are now joined by Daniel Taub. He's senior legal advisor to the Israeli government. Thanks for joining us. Your response, first of all, to allegations that Israel is guilty of war crimes for deliberately targeting civilian institutions.
Well, Israel, of course, isn't deliberately targeting civilian institutions. What it is targeting are terrorist bases, which Hamas, in total violation of every humanitarian principle, has actually located in the heart of civilian areas. At the very heart of humanitarian law is the principle that you have to make a distinction between combatants and civilians. But when you're fighting an organization like Hamas, which obviously doesn't wear uniforms, hides among civilian populations, has its leaders and its missiles in bunkers under sleeping children, that raises very, very complicated questions which every democracy that's fighting terrorism has had to try and deal with.
Well, let's clarify your answer there. Are you saying that if Israel thinks there are fighters near a civilian target or at a civilian target at a school, you think you have the right under international law to attack and shell a school packed with civilians, many of them children?
No, absolutely not. And it's certainly not as simple as that.
Well, that's what's happening, isn't it? I mean...
No. Let me just explain to you what international law says about it, because I think it's important to get this right. First of all, it is quite clear that the Geneva Conventions provide quite clearly that if something is a lawful military target, if it's a terrorist base, if it's a stockpile of missiles, it doesn't stop being a lawful missile target, lawful target, just because it's in a civilian area. And you can't really afford to adopt a policy that says that it does, because if you do, you're really inviting every terrorist organization in the world to set up shop in a hospital or a kindergarten. But that's not the end of the story. It's quite clear that if you are going to take measures, you have to make sure that they're proportionate. You have to make sure that the risk of collateral civilian damage, as it's called, is not excessive.
Right,
so here we have a terrible...
I'm sorry, but that's your interpretation of the international law. If we could come back to...
No, that's almost a quotation.
Well, others quote Article 32, which prohibits taking any measure of such a character to cause the physical suffering or extermination of protected persons. I don't want to get into a legal debate with you, but I'll come back to my question, which is, if Israel thinks there are people located in a school that is a civilian target, by everyone's admission, do you think Israel should fire on a school packed with civilians, even if you think Hamas fighters are there?
The question here of how you gauge what is a proportional response is a very tough one. If we look at the way that democratic countries have actually tried to confront terrorists hiding in civilian areas, we see that over the last few decades they've adopted standards which are certainly not as high, or certainly not always as high, as the standards that Israel has adopted for itself. There have been a significant number of cases where Israel had in its targets very significant leaders of the Hamas, but because that they had surrounded themselves with civilians, Israel refrained from attacking them. And even at the moment, when Israel does have to attack people who are firing missiles, it takes extraordinary measures, even sometimes putting its soldiers at risk and endangering operations, phoning up thousands of Palestinians, asking them to leave homes where terrorists are operating, even though this gives notice to the Hamas, dropping obviously thousands of leaflets, trying to send in ground troops in a situation that obviously puts soldiers at risk. So that's a very tough.
Is the case then, why are 3 schools within 24 hours, schools belonging to the UN, whose coordinates were provided to the Israeli military, hit?
That's a great question, and it's one that I hope that you are directing at the Hamas terrorists and asking them why.
Well, it wasn't the Hamas who fired at the school, it was the Israeli army, with all due respect, which fired on the school. I mean, you were talking about comparisons with other countries. When the Russians dealt with Beslan, they knew that there were gunmen inside the school. They didn't shell the whole school. I mean, you said it's a tough question to answer, but I'm asking you for your answer. Does Israel believe it has the right to shell a school full of civilians, some of them children, just because they think there are Hamas fighters there?
The answer is that Israel doesn't feel that it has the right to start shelling schools. It does have the right to do what's necessary to protect its civilians in accordance with international law.
So why are 3 schools hit within 24 hours whose coordinates were with Israeli officials then?
The fact that the fact that their school is in the neighborhood, and these of course are not functioning functioning schools. These are schools that are not filled with school children, but the fact that these schools are in the neighborhood of terrorist bases, the terrorists are deliberately operating in these areas, doesn't mean that Israel is not entitled to target them. What it does mean is that on a case-by-case basis, it has to do what Hamas is not doing. We have a conflict here where on one side we have a terrorist organization which is literally glorying in casualties on both sides. It's actually trying to have civilian casualties on the Israeli side, and it's rejoicing in Palestinian casualties because they give it some sort of thick public relations advantage. That doesn't relieve Israel of any of its humanitarian responsibilities. It means that we have to still at the same time weigh up how we can best protect the lives of our civilians while not causing excessive injury or harm to the lives of Palestinians. And that's a very, very tough question. It doesn't make for soundbite sort of answers. It means we have to weigh it up on a case-by-case basis.
What happens when you're wrong, Daniel? I mean, you said it time and time again, Hamas were operating, they were using these civilians as human shields. In fact, according to Chris Gunnis from UNRWA, he released a statement saying after a preliminary investigation of yesterday's attack, January 6th attacks at the Fakhura Girls Elementary School, we are 99.9% sure no militants were at that school.
You know, he's making a comment about what was going on in the school. Unfortunately, the tragic events yesterday related to terrorist activity which was outside the school, where we already know that two of the people that were killed in that were senior Hamas operatives.
That was not what the Israeli military was initially saying. I have a statement here from the Israeli military on Tuesday saying Hamas militants were firing mortars from the UN school in Jabalia that was being used as a shelter by hundreds of civilians, and they go on to name Ahmad Abu Ashkar and Hassan Abu Ashkar as being inside the school.
I haven't seen that statement. I can only tell you this on the basis of the information that I have. As you know, I'm in New York at the moment and not in Israel, so I can only tell you the information that I have, which was this is a conflict that was taking place outside the school, but obviously in the very close vicinity of the school.
Given the changing Israeli statements on what exactly happened and the discussion that we are having, isn't that a sign that there should be an independent international investigation as to why 3 UN schools packed with civilians whose coordinates were known and given to the Israeli army get hit in 24 hours? As
far as the question of investigations is concerned, we are another tremendous asymmetry, of course, between the Israeli and Palestinian side of this equation, is the fact that we don't think that we have all of the right answers. What we do think is that in contrast to the groups that we're fighting against, we are asking the right questions. How can we protect our civilians without causing undue harm to the civilians on the other side? When we fall short of that standard, when tragically, as every democracy has found in this situation, there are collateral civilian casualties, then we do investigate. And in those instances where we find that there's been wrongdoing, we actually prosecute and we take steps to try and correct them. I think that's in dramatic difference to the other side of the equation, where we have the throwing of sweets and celebrations when there are casualties and innocent men, women and children get killed.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Daniel Taub, the senior legal advisor to the Israeli government, thanks so much for joining us.